The story opens with piercing insight into the performance of status. Money talks, but true wealth is silent. It's the insecure who feel the need to broadcast their bank accounts to room. This leads into the introduction of a crystal chandeliered gala where Richard Hawthorne, the man in the navy suit, dominates the space with loud boasts about his corporate climb. Across from him sits Caleb Morgan, sipping whiskey with a stillness that Richard mistakes for the numbness of failure. The atmosphere is thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the sharp sting of Richard's laughter, setting the stage for a conflict where one man is playing for ego and the other is playing for the entire company. Before we continue, welcome to Brittany's Stories. This is a home of powerful, emotional, and unforgettable stories, filled with drama, secrets, unexpected twists, and life-changing moments. Each story is crafted to entertain, inspire, and keep you thinking long after the video ends. If you love shocking reveals, hidden identities, billionaire secrets, and stories that touch the heart, you're in the right place. Like our videos, if they move you, subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. The chandeliers of the ballroom cast an expensive, unforgiving light over the long table. It was professional gathering, part celebration, part high-stakes networking, where everyone seemed to be measuring their worth by titles and loud achievements. People were dressed meticulously, speaking with a volume that suggested their importance was tied to how much space they could fill with their voices. Caleb Morgan didn't contribute much to the noise. He never does. Across from him, Richard Hawthorne had been talking for most of the night, his words weaving a tapestry of growth, leadership, and the company he claimed to have built. Richard was the center of this golden cage, basking in the attention of those who believed his performance. Caleb had learned long ago that people are most comfortable when they think they understand you, using labels to simplify the world. They categorize others as successful or irrelevant just to find their own footing. That evening, Richard looked at Caleb and chose a label. He saw a quiet man who didn't fit the room's frantic energy and decided Caleb was nothing more than a background character in his story. Richard leaned forward, his navy suit sharp against the white linen of the table, performing for an audience he felt he already owned. He caught the eye of Lily Foster, who sat nearby, her attention a prize he was determined to secure through the belittlement of others won. With a sudden, jagged movement, Richard extended a finger, pointing it directly at Caleb's chest, a physical invasion of quiet space Caleb occupied. "Look at him," Richard said, his voice booming with the unearned confidence of a man who mistakes silence for weakness, too. "We're talking about global expansion and leadership, and here's Caleb, floating through life without a single responsibility." He paused, a smirk playing on his lips as he delivered the punchline. "He's broke, Lily, unemployed, and just taking up space while the rest of us build the future." 3. A few people at the table chuckled, their eyes darting toward Caleb to witness the humiliation. Caleb didn't flinch. He simply lifted his glass, the amber liquid catching the light, and took a slow, measured sip. Military training had taught him that a man who points a finger is usually trying to distract from his own lack of ground. 5. The laughter rippled around the table, a shallow and reflexive sound that signaled the group's immediate alignment with Richard's mockery. Across the crystal and fine china, eyes that had briefly scanned Caleb for signs of status now glazed over with a dismissive sheen. In a room where worth was measured strictly by titles and the volume of one's achievements, Caleb had been weighed and found wanting. He could feel the collective recalibration as the guests shifted their posture, physically distancing themselves from the man who just floats. To them, his silence was no longer a sign of depth. It was the quiet of the irrelevant. This was the isolation of the underestimated, a space Caleb inhabited with the practiced ease of his military years, where being unseen was often the greatest tactical advantage. He watched as they returned to their conversations, their interest in him extinguished by a single label. Richard's grin widened, fueled by the table's compliance. Caleb remained still, a silent observer in a golden cage, knowing that true authority never needs to demand the room's attention. It simply waits for the truth to speak. Caleb's mind drifted back, away from the clinking of silverware and the hollow laughter of the elite. In the military, he had learned that the most effective operations were those conducted in the shadows, where silence was a strategic asset rather than avoid 11-11. After leaving the service, he had applied that same cold discipline to a different battlefield. The market, too. He remembered meeting Jonathan Pierce in a cramped diner, the air thick with the scent of burnt, cheap coffee and the heavy weight of uncertainty 3. While others were chasing immediate headlines, they were building a foundation for. Jonathan had the vision for the product, but Caleb provided the tactical structure and the capital that didn't need to announce itself 5. They were the silent architects of the very empire Richard now claimed as his own. There were no interviews or celebratory galas then, only the steady, rhythmic progress of an invisible machine 6. Ownership, Caleb knew, didn't always need to shout. Sometimes it simply waited for the right moment to be seen 7. In the periphery of the gala's artificial glow, Teresa Bloom stood like a silent sentinel. As the HR manager, she was trained to notice the things others ignored. The subtle shifts in power, the cracks in the professional facade, and the dangerous weight of unchecked ego 1. From her vantage point in the corner, she watched Richard's performance with a practiced, unreadable expression. In her hands, she gripped a leather-bound folder containing the board review documents, the physical manifestation of a verdict already reached 2. While Richard continued to use his voice as a weapon against the man across from him, Teresa knew that the data on those pages would soon strip him of the very authority he was so desperately projecting 3. She glanced toward Caleb, her eyes meeting his for a fleeting, knowing second. There was no need for a signal. The documents she held were the final piece of a strategic move that had been in motion long before the first toast was made for. In this room of loud players, Teresa was a keeper of the truth, waiting for the moment when a performance would finally have an end 5. Richard leaned back, the satisfied smirk of a predator spreading across his face. He felt the room's energy leaning in his favor, and he couldn't resist one final, patronizing blow. "Look, Caleb," he said, his voice dropping into a tone of mock generosity that was louder than a shout. "I hate to see a man with your potential just wasting away. We're actually looking for someone to handle the basic logistics at the warehouse. It's entry level, sure, but it's a paycheck. It beats floating, doesn't it?" The table fell into a heavy, expectant silence. Richard looked around, inviting the others to join in his performative charity. Lily Foster's eyes remained fixed on her plate, the air in the room turning cold as the mockery crossed a line into cruelty. Richard chuckled, clearly enjoying the image of man he considered a failure, wearing a fluorescent vest in one of his loading docks. "You probably wouldn't understand complexities of our upcoming board review," he added dismissively, "but these things actually matter when you're finally employed." Caleb didn't reach for an insult. He simply watched Richard, noting the desperate need for validation that drove every word. He knew the trap was set, and Richard had just walked right into the center of it. Caleb set his glass down, the soft click of crystal against what sounding like a gavel in the sudden hush. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The military had taught him that the most devastating strikes are often the quietest. "I appreciate the offer, Richard," Caleb said, his gaze steady and devoid of malice. "But I think my schedule for the board review is already quite full." Richard's brow furrowed, a short, uncertain laugh escaping him as he looked around for support. "I told you, that's for the executive tier. You wouldn't even get past security." Caleb leaned in slightly, the movement controlled and predatory. "I'll be there," he continued, his tone as cool as the whiskey he'd been sipping. "Not as an employee, and certainly not as a warehouse hand. I'll be there as the majority shareholder. I believe that gives me a seat at the head of the table." The air in the room seemed to vanish instantly. The mocking grin on Richard's face didn't just fade. It disintegrated, replaced by a hollow, wide-eyed mask of dawning horror as the labels he had so carefully assigned began to catch fire. The silence that followed was heavy, a vacuum of sound where Richard's confidence used to live. Across the table, a young associate instinctively pulled out his phone, his thumbs moving with a frantic, nervous energy as he pulled up the official company registry. The blue light of the screen reflected in his glasses, his eyes widening as he scrolled past the board of directors and the executive summaries. He stopped at the very top. "He's not lying," the young man whispered, his voice cracking the stillness. He turned the phone toward the center of the table, showing the digital receipt that no one could argue with. There it was in a stark, sans serif font: Morgan Caleb, majority shareholder. The effect was instantaneous. Richard's world didn't just crumble, it vanished. The man who had been the loudest in the room seemed to physically shrink, his navy suit suddenly looking 2 sizes too large for his slumping frame. The color drained from his face, leaving behind a pale, waxen mask of realization. He stared at the name on the screen as if it were a death warrant. The labels had been rewritten in a single second, and for the first time that night, Richard Hawthorne had absolutely nothing to say. Caleb stood up, the chair scraping softly against the floor as the only sound in the vacuum of the room. He didn't look for an apology, and he didn't offer a final, cutting remark. In the military, he had been taught that power isn't a tool for embarrassment. It is a weight to be carried with responsibility. He looked at Richard, not with anger, but with a clinical, detached pity. The man was already socially and professionally undone, his reputation dissolving in the blue light of a smartphone screen. Caleb didn't need to fire him or orchestrate a grand exit. The truth had already performed the necessary surgery. As he walked toward the door, the air in the room seemed to recalibrate, the guests parting like a silent tide. He stepped out into the cool night air, away from the golden cage and the hollow pursuit of status. He realized then that his silence had been his greatest asset. True authority doesn't demand attention or correct every insult. It simply waits. Being underestimated wasn't a weakness. It was a perfect position from which to own the world.
Thank you for watching Brittany Stories. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more powerful stories you won't forget. And please leave a comment. I would love to hear from you.